After Abram received a call, Abram and his family traveled to the Negev, then from the Negev to Bethel, gradually returning to the land of promise. Abram had become wealthy in livestock, silver, and gold by this point, but so had his nephew, Lot. They would not have had a problem if the men's wealth had only been in silver and gold. However, their herds were too numerous to be contained in a single location. So, Abram went up from Egypt to the Negev with his wife and everything he had, and Lot went with him. Abram had become very wealthy in livestock and in silver and gold. From the Negev, he went from place to place until he came to Bethel, to the place between Bethel and Ai, where his tent had been earlier and where he had first built an altar. There, Abram called on the name of the Lord. Now Lot, who was moving about with Abram, also had flocks and herds and tents, but the land could not support them while they stayed together, for their possessions were so great that they were not able to stay together, and quarreling arose between Abram's herders and Lot's. The Canaanites and Perizzites were also living in the land at that time. So Abram said to Lot, "Let's not have any quarreling between you and me, or between your herders and mine, for we are close relatives." Genesis chapter 13, verse 1 to 8. Abram lived by faith rather than sight. Regardless of what Lot did, Abram was unconcerned about his future because he knew that everything was in the hands of the Lord. Abram had never read Psalm 47 verse 4 or Matthew chapter 6 verse 33, but he was applying both by faith. He'd met God at the altar and he knew everything was in order. Psalm 47 verse 4, "He will choose our inheritance for us, the excellence of Jacob, whom he loves, Selah." Matthew chapter 6 verse 33, "But seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things shall be added to you." He had met God at the altar, and he knew that everything was under control. When God is first in your life, it makes no difference who is second or last. Is not the whole land before you? Let's part company. If you go to the left, I'll go to the right. If you go to the right, I'll go to the left. Genesis chapter 13, verse 8 to 9. Abram realized he and Lot needed to separate. Surprisingly, Abram chose to preserve his relationship over maintaining his economic advantage. He let Lot choose his plot of land first. This was an extremely generous decision. In that culture, Abram had every right to make the first choice as head of the household, but because he believed in God's promise and provision, he was able to defer to Lot. You also have to remember that Lot was not instructed to follow Moses. Moses was, in reality, facing a result of his own decision. Lot looked around and saw that the whole plain of the Jordan towards Zoar was well watered, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. So Lot chose for himself the whole plain of the Jordan and set out toward the east. The two men parted company. Abram lived in the land of Canaan, while Lot lived among the cities of the plain and pitched his tents near Sodom. Now the people of Sodom were wicked and were sinning greatly against the Lord. Genesis chapter 13, verse 10 to 13. These verses describe the separation of Abram and his nephew Lot. They have both become extremely wealthy and do not have enough land for the two of them to live together. Lot's senses guide him, just as Eve's did when the serpent tempts her in Eden. Lot's decision to live near Sodom effectively eliminates him as Abram's heir. Sodom is a prosperous city, but it is not a just one. Lot considered the two options and noticed that the entire Jordan plain, all the way to Zoar, was well watered. He could see the material wealth in front of him, but he couldn't see what he should have seen, that it couldn't last. God was going to judge the region soon because the men of Sodom were evil and had committed numerous sins against the Lord. Lot, on the other hand, chose to get close to sin for the sake of material gain and the beauty of the moment, traveling eastward towards Sodom and Gomorrah. The Lord said to Abram, after Lot had parted from him, "Look around from where you are, to the north and south, to the east and west. All the land that you see, I will give to you and your offspring forever. I will make your offspring like the dust of the earth, so that if anyone could count the dust, then your offspring could be counted. Go, walk through the length and breadth of the land, for I am giving it to you." Genesis chapter 13, verse 14 to 17. Abram's eyes saw God's spiritual promise. The important lesson for Israel and for us here is that we must seek God's perspective on our circumstances rather than relying on our own. We only see the temporary. God sees the eternal. God's offer to Abram was long-term. I will give you and your offspring all the land that you see forever. Furthermore, God seemed to expand on his promise, telling Abram that his descendants would multiply so rapidly that they would be as numerous as the dust of the earth. The best part is that Abram would not have to do anything to make this happen. God stated unequivocally, I will give it to you. The wonderful thing about obeying God is that you don't have to take what is yours. He freely gives it to you. So Abram went to live near the great trees of Mamre at Hebron, where he pitched his tents. There he built an altar to the Lord. Genesis chapter 13, verse 18. Abram relocated his tent near the oaks of Mamre and Hebron, where he built another altar to the Lord. He heard and received God's promise, worshiping God because of his word and finding security in it. Unlike in Egypt, Abram was now moving by faith rather than sight, which would be the foundation, not only of his obedience, but also of the obedience that God desires for all who follow him. 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 7. For we live by faith, not by sight. For the second time since Abram's departure from Ur, God confirms his promise to him. Genesis chapter 12, verse 7. Then the Lord appeared to Abram and said, to your descendants I will give this land. And there he built an altar to the Lord, who had appeared to him. In this section, he describes the land in all of its dimensions, as well as Abram's numerous descendants, promising that they will be as numerous as the dust of the earth. When God instructs Abram to walk the length and breadth of the land, he is essentially directing Abram to establish a legal claim to it. Abram dedicates the land to the Lord by erecting another altar in the southern part of Hebron. The narrative further specifies that this location is near the great trees of Mamre. Mamre was a local Canaanite who probably owned the land on which these landmark trees were situated. His itinerant wandering now has a new purpose, almost akin to conquest, because everything he walks through will be given to him and his family. When Abram and Lot separate, they are traveling south from Bethel. Lot travels toward Jericho and the Jordan Valley, eventually crossing at Jordan's fords and traveling south on the east side of the Dead Sea to the vicinity of Sodom and Gomorrah. Abram travels south through Jerusalem, Bethlehem, and the Negev to reach Hebron. The construction of an altar here, as at Bethel, transforms it eventually into an important religious site, and its subsequent use as a burial place for the ancestors established its political importance. However, the story of Lot and Abraham is far from over. Abraham is forced into a war because of Lot. To watch that story, click here.